Thank you all for joining us for this panel. My name is Dan Lips. I'm a senior fellow at FREOPP. I've been with FREOPP since 2019. If you've been with us throughout the day, one of the key issues that's come up just at lunch now and earlier this morning is the cost of school closures. Earlier, a panelist described the decision to close schools during the pandemic as the most costly public policy mistake in the last century, going back to the Great Depression. And just now at lunch, Ovik was talking about the scientific debate that happened back in 2020, looking at the risks that children faced and school teachers faced due to the coronavirus. At that time, when FREOPP began looking at this, when Ovik said, hey, we need to come out and saying that it's safe, with a report saying that it's safe to reopen schools, the science that he was looking at was clear, but it was certainly not well appreciated or understood by the American public. But when it came to the education side, there was no doubt what was going to happen if we closed our schools. We knew that learning losses would be significant, that they would take years and years to recover, and that the disparities would be the costs would be greatest for those who are most disadvantaged. This was clear. And just over the past 2 months, we've seen some pretty alarming evidence that our worst fears of what would happen have happened. With the recent scores on the National Assessment of Educational Progress, we saw decades of academic achievement scores decline, and we saw the achievement gap between rich and poor children increase. And it's our job with this panel to look forward. We've heard a lot about looking back at some of the mistakes that have been made, but what we are trying to do here today is ask what can be done. And I'm thrilled to be with an esteemed panel of practitioners, education reform leaders, and state legislators to address this. Starting with Representative Garrison, you come from a family of teachers. You're on the front lines in Florida, where for a long time, education reform experts around the country have been looking to as a national model. What do you think we should learn from the experience during the pandemic, and how can we begin to recover?
Well, thanks, Dan, and I bring you greetings from the free state of Florida. In answer to your question, there is, I believe, a universal consensus to your point on the destructiveness of school closures. We see that even in Florida, which by comparison with the rest of the United States had the close for the least. We have in-person education happening as quickly as possible, but we're seeing the damage like everyone else. It's just not as bad as everyone else. What I would say going forward, the first thing you have to do before you can fix a problem is you have to understand it. And so the data is coming in and we're starting to see it, but what I fear is going to happen is that we will accept it as just something that happened. And what can you do to get back to the status quo, the business as normal? I was reminded, in thinking about this topic, there's a book I read some years ago, I think David Satter wrote it about communist Russia. The title is, it was a long time ago and it never happened anyway, right? In terms of how they addressed the communist past. My concern is for those of us who care about this issue, care about the education of our kids, that we'll look back and say, oh, school closures, that was a long time ago. It never really happened anyway, and we move forward. Meanwhile, the students who were adversely affected fall farther and farther behind because, as we know with education, it's cumulative, right? So that's my concern. Before we get to policy prescriptions about what to do to fix the problem, there has to be a recognition of exactly what happened, and then a political consensus that just saying, oh, well, what are you going to do is not acceptable. And getting through those two hurdles is, to my mind, the biggest initial threshold that has to be crossed. Then you can talk about, okay, well, what are we going to do about it?
On that point, there was a recent prominent article calling for an amnesty for what was done, the decisions that were made during the pandemic. I saw on Twitter, Derrell, that you took some issue with these comments.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and thanks for sitting me up here with smart people who know how to dress like libertarians. So it's interesting. So if you're a writer, you also know that you often don't get to write the headline for your story. You write the story. And I happen to think that Professor Oster, Emily Oster, was one of the people, like, at the very earliest parts of the pandemic who was sort of saying the data says we should have schools open. And if you read the piece, she does say the right, but the headline is what is the whole thing, in this instance. And I do think the headline's important because, just to your point, Representative Garrison, people are acting like we should just move on, And I've made the analogy on this that this isn't an earthquake that happened on land where the shaking happens all at once, you see the effects of it, and then it's over. It's more like one that happened underwater, right? And what we're waiting for actually is the tidal wave of its impact to crash onto our daily lives, right? And that's gonna be real. It's gonna take a long time, and we can't get past it if we don't acknowledge that it actually happened. So this specific thing, I think this is crucial. Like, people are looking at me like I want the theater. I wanna analyze what happened in a public way so that it doesn't happen again. And the one thing I would just say to this is that I think you can diagnose what happened in two ways that are particularly important, and I think this is part of the Oster piece. One is that you could say the problem is the systems of public education handled a respiratory pandemic in the wrong way, right? Which I think is part of what we heard in the lunch session or whatever, and that is one way to look at it. You could also look at it in another way, which is the way I tend to look at it, which is that the political interests in public education have figured out that when they deny the compulsory service of public education to people, they can get things. And this has presented itself in school closures in Kentucky and Oklahoma and West Virginia and Arizona and Los Angeles and Chicago and New York and Seattle and Columbus, Ohio, for instance. That is a different problem. And so I would just throw out there that I think it is really important as states and as a nation, if we care about our kids, that we get in on that. Like, somebody's going to have to pay. I'm sorry, like somebody will be found responsible. I don't think that's a witch hunt. I think that's an important process to make sure that we don't leave another generation of kids behind in the future if something like this happens again.
Gavin, as a charter school founder and former teacher, can you weigh in?
Sure. Yeah, I think my school stayed open, but also offered a hybrid remote version, and parents could opt to either stay fully hybrid, fully remote, fully in person, and they could change every 6 weeks. Because I think we didn't know the right way to go forward, and we had parents with diverse opinions. So some parents didn't want to be in under any circumstance for personal or family reasons or health concerns. Some could not stay remote. And I think I'm contrarian a little bit. So I think, one, the kids who struggled and suffered are seeing great losses right now. Long term, we'll probably be fine. We see there's like a lot of great research on European students during World War II. And immediately afterwards, they were years behind on grade levels. After 3 or 4 years being back in school after World War II, they were all caught up and had no long-term earnings or adverse effects. So I'm hopeful that's what happens, and I think we'll probably see that. But I'm sorry.
I was going to just weigh in there. And one of the things that I think it gets missed in the debate about whether schools should have been open was that schools were struggling before the pandemic. I think if we were having this conversation back in the spring of 2020, we would not be just hoping that schools stayed open for the next 2 years. So I think there is a question of how can we make sure that we are improving these opportunities beyond what had existed back at the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think the real problem was not whether schools stayed open or not. It is why every school leader made the decision they made. I think in retrospect, it was the right call to stay open, but at the time, very hard to know what to do in the moment, trying to gauge your community. And even though Ovik was reading the papers, I don't think Ovik or anybody in DC or even people on the ground, no one knew the exact right answer. And it's very hubristic, I think, in the moment to say, here's what parents should do. And too many of our school leaders were responding to incentives that were not about what parents actually wanted on the ground. So when I'm thinking about how do we look going forward, we should step back and actually analyze the incentives that led school leaders to do what they wanted to do. And from my viewpoint, This is about how we fund schools. So schools are funded based on attendance, and that is why the only thing schools care about is how many kids are counted as being in their seat. And then they get some funding based on graduation rates, and so every kid graduates whether they learn anything or not. And then during COVID, they said, we don't know how to do attendance remotely, so we're just going to give schools a free pass. And of course, they weren't going to work, because like if I said you'll get your salary whether you work or not this year, like you're going to go on strike.
Sign me up.
Yeah, for health reasons too. So let's take a step back and look at the incentives that led people to make decisions they made.
Can sorry, I just want to hop on this because I think this is really so. So I agree with your position on this. So we in March of in April of in March of 2020, I remember I was in Georgia giving a speech, and a New York Times reporter was giving me a lot of hell because I was in Georgia. She was like, "Why aren't you in your apartment?" Right? And New York City public schools closed down that Friday, and I was at the front of the line. I was like, "Close it all down, everything." Right? By August, I was like, there's something else going on here. And I think to your point about incentives, for me, the answer was if a parent wants an in-person option, they should be able to get one. And I think what was being exposed at that point was if the incentives were you were going to get paid even if you weren't open, that it was easier to unilaterally make the decision to close, versus, and like Catholic schools dealt with this because they didn't get paid to be closed, for the most part. So I do think this, how you have reduced this to like what incentives for individual school leaders responding to is a really good way to look at it. And we have huge systems of schools that respond to being rewarded for not being open, and that also had an effect on all of this. So yeah, thank you for that.
Turning the discussion to what we should be doing now, I'm interested to hear thoughts. We're a couple of months away from legislative sessions. There's some really promising things that have happened during the pandemic, some in civil society with the launch of microschools, increased homeschooling. There have been some really exciting new choice mechanisms that have been passed in Arizona and West Virginia. Florida's long been the leader. What are you all looking to do?
Well, you're exactly right, and I preach the virtues of Florida with the zeal of the converted. Having grown up in Illinois and kind of seeing what life in a blue state is a very different environment, come down to Florida and you kind of think everyone is like that. I remember talking to my nephews who were in Virginia, actually, in the Tidewater area, and this is not 2020, this is 2021, right? Floridian students had been back in school in person for over a year, and yet my two teenage nephews, neither one are stellar students, were still learning at home, and I use air quotes because literally there was not a lot of learning going. They were at home, there was not a lot of learning happening, a year and a half after the pandemic, and their grades suffered. Everything suffered, right? We hope they can come back over time, but it's real. And I remember saying to my wife, why don't they just go to a different school? And then I realized, oh yeah, they can't, because the policies in, Virginia's not exactly, it's not exactly California we're talking about here, but so we take for granted, those of us in Florida, some of the virtues that have been happening over the last 20 years, starting with Governor Bush and have continued through Governor DeSantis. I take that for granted. So the bottom line is we do an education bill every year in Florida. We do an education bill every year. The mantra is choice, 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 and the focus is on what's good for families. I know what's good for my kids. You know what's good for your kids. I know how my kids learn. It's going to be different. And so ultimately, we're going to continue to follow that model, whether it's in traditional public schools, whether it's in charters, whether it's in what we're seeing now, and I call it kind of hybrid education, and utilizing some of the technology we got during the pandemic and applying that to all sorts of different education options for students. I think ultimately, I will tell you from my perspective, I want to ultimately get to the day where the money follows the student. I mean, that's the holy grail. Because ultimately, if you're a believer in competition, you're a believer in the power of ideas, that's where you want to be. But you've got a little ways to go, but you're going to continue to see movement in that direction, I think, in states like Florida. And ultimately, with the states being the laboratory of democracy, if it works, you're going to see if it works. And if we fail, you're going to see that it fails. But it's not going to be for lack of effort. And the ultimate hope is if we can do some things in a when you have a city like Miami-Dade, which has the most school choice options probably in the country, and one of the most diverse, multicultural, diversity, not just in terms of financial diversity, ethnic diversity, language diversity, you name it. And you see success. If it can work in Miami, I assure you it can work anywhere else. So that's what we're going to continue to do. Continue to experiment, continue to focus on choice, and hopefully it'll pay off.
Derrell, I'd be curious on your thoughts, working with the network of education reformers across the country. What do you see as the big opportunity to change policy to expand equal opportunity based on all that's happened?
Yeah, so I kind of want to build on Representative Garrison's notes. So we have 4 things that we're thinking about in terms of kind of like laying the groundwork for the education system of the future to emerge. Fund families, so that's like finance reform and direct aid to families. We want to protect the innovations of the pandemic, be they in system or out of system. Something around measurement so that like families can know if things are working, and then no boundaries, because with like the whole residential assignment thing, the redlining thing, the mindset of scarcity around new school creation, like those are sort of like our 4 forces that we try to align policy against. I do think the thing that has been kind of the 2 things that have been most important about the pandemic that have sort of that I think are top of mind and positioned well to make change in the near term that is important in the long term are direct aid to families, right? So I think like 9 states passed programs where either pandemic aid or formula aid or something like that went to a family so they could handle education expenditures on their own. Obviously, West Virginia and Arizona passed these like sweeping ESA plans trying to one-up Florida. So the game is out there, sir. These are transformative in terms of like the relationship with everything, and if you want something to happen, you got to be able to pay for it. So I think that's incredibly important. And the other thing is just in terms of like, it's kind of 2 things. It's place and bundling. So you know, the relationship between school, like normally you send your kid to school, you get the whole thing bundled up, right? And that's a huge advantage. And for some people that works, right? Like I go to my neighborhood school, I get the whole thing. But I think what we saw during the pandemic is that people are like, well, you know, I like my kid at home with me 3 days out of the week, and I want to send them to you 2 days out of the week, right? Or I'm fine with language arts and science, but I like this enrichment thing. Or, you know, you can look at like the stuff that Vela Fund and other folks are doing, or like opt-in hybrid, you know, this kind of stuff where people are like, I want to be totally out of system. You know, I like trees. Like, I know that sounds like a joke, but like the tree thing is live, right? like lots of people are into arboreal education or kind of whatever you call it. And so the fact that people have embraced a model about learning that is wildly more flexible in terms of time and wildly more flexible in terms of place, I think are key features of things we could be doing from here forward.
Gavin?
Sure, yeah. I think Representative Garrison has it right in this idea of having dollars follow the student. And the problem is right now, dollars follow kids according to the state's formula. So, you know, if you want to split up, your kid goes 3 days a week to a partial school program and then 2 days to an intense enrichment chess club. You can't do that because, well, one, there's a barrier to entry to actually get state dollars. So you have to be, if you're a charter school, approved through this often arbitrary process by an authorizer, which is very subjective. If you are, you know, district schools can't get open. Parochial schools have their own strange process in certain voucher states. So one, there's a barrier to entry to actually get state dollars, and then parents can't decide how to allocate. So one challenge we had at my school, during COVID, the state said, we'll give you dollars no matter what you do with your kids. And so we had a pretty robust virtual program. And what we actually found is that for some students, especially students with special needs, our virtual program was more effective than when they were in person. So we have a high proportion of students with ADHD or autism. In person, they have a hard time focusing, sometimes oppositional defiance disorder. They would get into fights with other students. They felt very judged. At home, they could control their environment and have a safe space with their parents or with grandparents. And they actually wanted to continue that even post-COVID. They wanted to continue getting our online program. The state said, we're not going to give you funding for that because they're not in attendance officially unless you have a virtual program and you have to go through this application process to open that. So even though they wanted to come to us, the dollars didn't really follow parent choice. It was according to the state's formula. So I think the kind of big picture answer to how do we keep a lot of the innovations is you get rid of a one-size-fits-all state model for what school should look like, and that limits barriers to entry and also limits where kids and what they can do, where kids can go, and how they can spend the money.
Well put. One of the questions I want to put to you all involves the federal role. We're here in Washington. A lot of us in this room focus on federal policy. We've seen this really unprecedented expenditure over the past 2 years during the pandemic. About $190 billion have gone out the door. First, it was described as trying to help reopen schools. Once schools were open, it was described as helping kids recover. Turns out much of that money is still available, more than $120 billion. Have you guys looked at this, and any thoughts on how that could be put to use in Florida?
Yeah, I just want to say it's a total waste.
Yeah.
It is every federal dollar towards education is a colossal waste of money. They try to target what, again, this is the hubris, right? And politicians say, here's what I think is important to fund, right? Social emotional learning or like thermomaguns or whatever. And they make these grants for it. And then schools have to lie about how we're going to spend the money. So they submit applications that lie about doing it. And they pay back office people to do kind of like creative financial accounting to say that we spent the money on something related to COVID that was like water fountains that we needed anyway. I mean, it is a ridiculous exercise that, again, tries to shape public education from a bunch of people who don't know what dollars should be going towards. And I know because we did this. Like, our CSP grant was a ridiculous application. I shouldn't have been defrauded.
I know a good lawyer. You're fine. I'll speak to. I share your frustration with the federal government, and will probably shock you to hear that I'm from Florida when I say that. But one of the things that I think the federal government could have a very positive role in is with infrastructure for rural Florida and rural communities. When you go look, places like Tampa, places like Miami, places like Jacksonville, where I'm from, we're going to have dysfunction, but ultimately we have assets, we have resources. If you go to Bay County, Florida, if you go to Gulf County, if you go to Wakulla County, you go to Lafayette County, first of all, the schools are the heartblood of these communities. Second of all, they cannot tax their citizens enough to build a new school. They simply can't do it. And so similar to how the federal government has a role in making sure that we have road infrastructure that goes through all parts of the country, rural, urban, whatever. We have a federal highway network. We have federal infrastructure. The federal government, if they really wanted to make a difference in the lives of Floridians and folks around the country, is to utilize that money we're quite frankly, I think, wasting, and utilize something that really work, which is providing access to capital dollars for rural communities. They're not doing that, which is unfortunate. But if you're asking me how we can get the most bang for our federal dollars, let the states do what the states do best, which is come up with innovative ideas and make sure how we're going to teach our kids and make sure hold us accountable as states for the results. Hold us accountable. But the federal government can provide a role to assist with what I call the infrastructure of the bricks and mortars community of schools for folks that literally can't afford them. And if we want to unless we want to see our rural communities wither and die, at some point in time, we have to have the ability to have that sort of infrastructure, whether it's in traditional brick and mortar public or whether it's in charter or whatever. But that's where the federal government, to my mind, has a role that can be played.
Yeah, I want to apologize to Gavin because I thought I was handing the mic over, so I grabbed the mic, and then the mic was here, and I looked like I was, give me the mic. So I want to answer one question and then a different question than when you asked. Also, broadband seems to be a thing that people, there's some consensus on, or at least there was some consensus on. From day-to-day consensus is, I don't know what people have consensus on, but broadband actually is infrastructure, and I think to the extent that is also about economic growth. One of the reasons why you can set up a town in rural West Texas, right? And you could start your, tech startup there if you got fiber there, and that would be good for the school. And, so I think that's another infrastructure example. The one thing I would just say about the COVID relief money is that it's a double-edged sword. So on the one hand, we should be using, schools or families should be using this money to intervene for their kids, right? And to me, that would be, we could do the equivalent of sort of a payroll tax cut on education enrichment if we just gave families the money, right? If you want everybody to have more money, here you go, right? And that would get the money out of the door, because right now it seems to be log jammed in the bureaucracy that Gavin described so well, but never participated in. But the other thing is, I would just say that we also have a system right now that is very good at seeing fiscal cliffs and driving right off of them. And if you care about inflation, right, or an inflationary environment, the fact that schools and school districts could spend 120 billion, ultimately 190 billion of federal dollars, lock in increases, whatever, that are basically from one-time revenue, not recurring revenue, means that we're passing on $190 billion tax increase to localities, right, to states and school districts or whatever. And I think that is something that the federal government should be worried about, because there will be enormous pressure from states across the aisle to fill that bucket, if this is allowed to happen. And I see a large likelihood of something like that happening.
I want to get your all thoughts on, do you want to weigh in on that one?
Oh, yeah, I just want to, I would push back. I actually think people often talk about infrastructure or like Wi-Fi and electrification as like appropriate federal dollars. Again, I've seen it. So the FCC, right, came out and was like, here's a big grant of money. We will give away if you explain how you use it for Wi-Fi type things during COVID. So our school applied for a Wi-Fi enabled bus and like hundreds of mobile hotspots that we didn't really need, but we had no access to the money otherwise. And I think the same thing we see with infrastructure, which you have like people build ridiculous, enormous school buildings and sports fields that aren't actually in the best interest of kids when you can be more flexible and space efficient. But because that's what the bonds that local legislatures and that some federal dollars go to. And if you want to, I think we should fund rural people more. And the way to do it is you just say everyone has, let's say every student in America has $10,000 as a voucher to go anywhere, anything educational you want. Rural communities or low-income communities get $20,000, right? So yeah, we need to redistribute wealth to those neighborhoods, but again, put money in the hands of parents so they can spend it. Maybe we want to actually have schools and mobile buses or something.
I want to get your all's thoughts on transparency and the need to understand, give parents the information about where their kids are and what needs to be done to help them advance in their education in this, where we are currently with the learning losses from the pandemic, but also as we move towards this more decentralized world. In the past, we've looked at grading schools, snapshots of student performance year over year. What should we be doing now? I know Florida's made some innovations here.
Yeah, and within the last year, 20, 30 years ago, when Governor Bush first, championed these reforms in Florida, we were one of the first folks to get to do, regular testing and grading with the understanding that, you are what you measure. And so we want to make sure we were getting accurate measurements of how our students were performing. We've made a substantial shift in Florida over the last year to go from annual testing to regular progress monitoring. So you have, as part of all of our school assessment, our individual student assessment, we're doing regular monitoring of learning. So we're not one big test at the end of the year. We're doing quarterly evaluations of the students, making sure the parents get that information. So if there are corrections that need to happen, we're able to do it, hopefully respond more promptly and with a bigger data set. So to your point initially, transparency is coming. All right, society is evolving to a point to where institutions that don't embrace transparency just aren't going to be sustainable in the long term. Just where we are. The world is flat. We are getting more in terms of innovation, competition, transparency, and ultimately, if you have good data, that then allows you to make policy choices. Ultimately, they're going to be in the best interest of the student, and not just doing things because we've always done them that way.
So I will give an answer, and then Gavin will give a more heterodox one. So in our net, we're in 9 states working on like all kinds of buckets of education policy across the whole sort of spectrum. And our folks care a lot about annual assessments, in part because they still have a foot in that world, right? And the ritual of like you get your annual assessment, schools adjust or don't adjust or whatever, has revealed a lot, right? A lot of underlying issues about the American education system, so we think that's important. We also know the politics of it are like a mess, and it's in the lurch, when I say the whole like idea of measurement, for lots of different reasons. And so we're also very oriented toward like the something new, like so. And I always say, how do you get Strava for education? Like how will we apply the sort of opt-in principles of the health fitness revolution to how people think about their own learning, right? And like Dan and I were talking about this, I was telling him when I'm not busy being fat, I cycle. And when I cycle, I'm on Strava, right? So you can find out about all of the people who are like my age and my weight who did the same thing, right? And if you care about extrinsic motivation or intrinsic motivation, it's incredibly sort of helpful. So that's a thing that I think we should think about. The one caveat I will say to that is that what we're also very concerned about is the effect that measurement has on what is created. And we're not interested in sort of like, and I'm a notorious charter school booster, but we're not interested in creating this sort of constrained engine of new education creation that the ritual of assessments around the early CMOs created in charter world, right? And I do think that that focus is wonderful for some kids. I'm ride or die for some of these schools, like absolutely. But over time, you just start making the same thing over and over and over again, and we don't want to see that replicated in all of the spaces of new learning that have emerged over the last couple of years.
Sure. Yeah, I think those are both. I just want to add on. I think it's totally right. I think you need like three parts really for transparency and good information. So one is you actually need parent choice, right? If no matter how your school performs, you're stuck at monopoly, nobody cares, right? Like no one's going to track it and so in places with parent choice, like New Orleans, where every school is a charter school, you actually have robust and transparent information because parents go and seek it out because they know if they don't like what's happening, they can switch. So first, and this is probably what drives everything else, you need to give parents the power to choose their educational options. Then you need accurate information. And this is really the role of the government. So right now our government does direct service of education and then also tries to regulate the market by overseeing charter schools, right, which is a weird conflict of interest. Really what they should just do is function like the SEC or the FDA, where they have a single, easy process to open a new educational option, and then they monitor that they're complying with the laws, and they have some accurate way to report transparent information, just like public companies need to report financials every quarter. I think we do a terrible job. I think every state test in this country is fraudulent because you have teachers administering the test to their own students, and the teachers and their schools and their principals are judged by the results of the test. So it's like if parents were administering the SAT to their own children, right? Like they don't always cheat in ways that are obvious or catchable, but you lean into a kid who, you're like, oh, didn't you remember when we went over that last month? Oh, like this is what that word means. Teachers who maybe feel bad for kids lean in and try to help them out. So I think we need better transparent information. And then the third part, which pops up, you talk about Strava, like how come when you want to go buy a cell phone today, you don't actually go look at the specs from the manufacturer. You go to Engadget or Gizmodo or PC Mag, YouTube. Exactly. So when you have parent choice and you have reliable data, you'll have third-party organizations that pop up to then give information and robust parent reviews of schools. And I think that kind of system will create a market-like effect where bad schools die out and good schools perpetuate.
Very well put. We have 5 minutes left, so I wanted to open the conversation up to questions if anyone in the audience had. You can just speak.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's really interesting. One thing I'm wondering is the sort of other element that's required to make choice really work is the sort of flexibility of supply, where the good schools are able to take in more students who might be migrating from schools that are underperforming. And I'm wondering, given your perspectives and experience, how to make that work in practice. Because sitting as someone outside, it doesn't seem like the kind of thing that could easily be scaled up if parents were informed, had the flexibility to move kids.
Yeah, I can speak to Florida. And again, we don't have everything right, but we do a lot. We don't have boundaries, right? So if I want to send my kid, if I want to drive to Hillsborough County 3.5 hours every day and take my daughter to a high-performing Hillsborough County school, I could do it. Now, they have to have space, right? So there has to be space, but there's nothing that stops that from happening. So there's a policy choice. And so that's when we talk about the money following the student. Are your incentives aligned, right? If your incentives are misaligned, you're going to continue to have those problems where it just doesn't make sense. How is this going to work? But if your incentives are properly aligned to where the high-performing schools that parents from across the region want to send their students to can receive those students and have a financial benefit associated with the receipt of those students, they're going to work like hell to try to attract them, and they're going to fight for those students. They're going to compete for them. That's the whole point of choice, is that competition makes us better. If I never have a race, I'm not going to be as, to get reelected, I'm not going to be as diligent about constituent services than I am if I know that I've got to deliver for my constituents, right? So that's the big part. The other thing, I'll piggyback on that, and I want to let these guys answer this question too before we run out of time. Choice, I know I'm speaking to the converted here, but choice is not just good policy, it's good politics. My God, it is good politics. Governor DeSantis didn't win Florida by 20 points 2 nights ago just because he's a great guy, all right? He did it in a large part because of a laser focus on what really matters to families, which is their kids' education. It is good politics. It plays in every corner of the state. And so my hope is that eventually, I would love nothing more than for both the major parties in the United States to embrace choice, to embrace these innovative solutions we're talking about in urban environments, rural environments, everywhere in between, because that makes us better. Ultimately, the kids are going to be better. So when we talk about repairing the damage from COVID school closures, one of the things that we all agree on is that choice makes us better. My wife teaches at a private independent school, and when they went online during the pandemic, their school kind of had I call it an oh crap moment, right? Because their whole thing was about catering to the in-person experience for the students. Well, now they're online, all the public schools are online. Well, why the heck am I going to pay to send my child to a public school if they're all online? So they had an existential crisis, and they knew right then and there they had to be the best dang online provider of education in the region, or they were going to lose their jobs. Because why would you send your kid to a private online school? And they innovated, they were creative, and those students had a much better experience than the folks who didn't have that incentive structure, right? So it goes to alignment of incentives. I'm sorry it takes so long to answer your question, but I think that's ultimately the answer.
So this is about the role of the government. So in some states, so New York City is on one side, and let's say like the SEC is on the other side. With the SEC, right, and a for-profit company, if you want to open another McDonald's, as long as it's within the law, you just do it, and you don't have to get approval for it, and it's you just file. In New York, there's a moratorium on charter schools. So this is they don't allow more seats, right? Because you need to get approval, and it's run by like politics, and they said no more. Missouri, which is where I opened the school, somewhere in the middle. Like you technically need to apply to ask your sponsor, but it's mostly a rubber stamp because our sponsors get paid a proportion of what you get paid, and so they kind of want to expand. I think the more we can move government structures to the SEC model, where or any sort of for-profit structure, the more you allow good public schools to expand. And it's easy to do, right? Like one thing that's, I know this may be not what you're asking, but public education is a great market because you have a consistent guaranteed consumer base. And so if I can say to a bank, I can for sure enroll the 500 students at Derrell School if you can let me open another building right next to him. And if I can give evidence that I can get those kids to come to my school, that's a really reliable loan. And so there's actually a lot of capital to do that if you have a market environment where I can guarantee that those kids can come to my school.
Yeah. I know they're trying to shut it down, but I just want to give a shout out for Arizona on this. I think when you think about supply, you have to have like three sides of it. You need open enrollment. It's important, an important piece. You want private school choice, also important, but you also want charter schools in both the cities and the suburbs, right? Or alternative modes of learning. That has really opened up public school choice for like low-income kids to go to much wealthier districts, and it has diversified the constituency that supports school choice broadly in Arizona, which is why they have the policy environment they have.
Great way to close. Representative Garrison, Derrell, Gavin, thank you for joining us and sharing your insights.
Thank you.